Hi everyone, my name is Luke, and welcome back to another special Horror Month edition of ThursDev. This week, I'd like to dive into the human psyche a little bit, as it's presented within video games. Last week, we talked about the concept of terror, how the uncertain, how paranoia, helplessness, and urgency create a feeling of dread far more powerful than that of any horrifying creature. This week, I'd like to take it a step further and look at one set of mechanics that attempts to harness this terror and amplify it with the power of the human mind. If you're a connoisseur of the horror genre, chances are that you're already familiar with the works of legendary early 1900s fiction author Howard Phillips H.P. Lovecraft. It may not necessarily be considered required reading in any school curriculum, but Lovecraft's eldritch cosmic horror writings led to the creation of some of the most enduring concepts used widely in horror to the present day. Though he himself was notably influenced by the writings of his forebears Edgar Allan Poe, Robert W. Chambers, and others, his is the name that so many horror creators invoke when attempting to create something truly uncomfortable and frightening. Though well known for the Cthulhu mythos that he created, which is pervasive in strange tales to the present day, he has a massive body of work that deals with many themes consistent with the definitions of terror as laid out by Anne Radcliffe. And one that stands out perhaps even greater than most is his dealings with the concept of the fragility of the human mind. When one considers that Lovecraft's own personal life was racked by the long-reaching effects of the mental health of those around him, both his parents falling into insanity, his father of syphilis, and his mother having died while infirm in a mental hospital, it's no wonder that while dealing with the fear that his madness may be hereditary, that he could one day lose his self, he spent a large amount of his creative energy exploring the concept of insanity and mental illness, and how fear and terror affect the human mind. The era in which Lovecraft lived was, in a way, the perfect time for someone like him to explore concepts like human fragility and insignificance. Many of the era had the difficulty in coming to grips with the concept of the true vastness of space as humanity rapidly learned more and more of the cosmos above and around us. Scientific discovery paved the way for a grand focus on the concepts of fear of the unknown, a very real part of life in a time when humanity realized that the Milky Way wasn't the end of the universe, that even the greatest thing that we ourselves could witness is insignificant in the face of the vastness of space. Lovecraft focused on the grotesqueness of discovery and knowledge far beyond ourselves. Other horror authors of the era also explored the same themes, notably Chambers' King in Yellow stories, about a play that causes the reader to go mad. This concept, that witnessing something strange or unnatural to the human mind, or gaining too much knowledge, could cause us to break, is a powerful notion, and one that isn't without credence, as post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety psychosis are very real mental health issues. But these stories take it to the extreme, and through their portrayal created a horror dynasty. Fiction, however, is for all intents and purposes a one-way street usually. It's for this reason that games are one venue wherein, thanks to the interactive medium, we're able to really play with these concepts and present them to our audience in meaningful ways. And many of the fictional hooks of madness through grim revelation and trauma that Lovecraft created continue to be exploited into the present. Many notable games to deeply explore sanity, fear, and stress mechanics in games are heavily influenced by Lovecraft's works. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, Eternal Darkness, Requiem of Sanity, Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and the recent roguelike dungeon crawler Darkest Dungeon are shining examples among many others. All of these games are heavily informed by the works of Lovecraft, and each one, beyond just setting, also presents sanity or primal fear as a central mechanic. In each of these games, though it is obviously a gross oversimplification of the actual mechanics of the human mind, sanity becomes, for all intents and purposes, a simple numeric value. It may be displayed differently or not at all depending on the game, but overall sanity is presented on something of a sliding scale, from completely sane, or at least as near the game is willing to let you become, to completely broken. In an attempt to gamify the mechanics of losing one's mind, our first stop will not be a digital game, however, but back in the venerable land of pen and paper, with the Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game. Call of Cthulhu was not dissimilar to many other dice-heavy role-playing games of its era, but one of its most outstanding mechanics was its handling of sanity as a player attribute. The short version of sanity in the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game is that when the player character is exposed to something that the game's keeper, analogous to the DM in Dungeons & Dragons, deems fit to damage a character's psyche, they would roll a D100, that's a 100-sided die, against their own sanity stat. If they exceeded their stat, they would lose sanity points as per an additional roll, and if a single sanity loss exceeds a certain threshold, they would become traumatized and need to make an intelligence check, this time hoping to exceed their intelligence, as quote-unquote successful rolls would mean that the player fully comprehended what they experienced and suffer a mental break just long enough for the keeper to gain full control over that character, long enough to do something terrible. As with many role-playing games, the rules are a bit hefty, but with a vast array of phobias, psychoses, and disabilities that the keeper could dole out to players, and thanks to the nature of tabletop role-playing games being limited only by human imagination, the way that these insanities could manifest were great and myriad. In the case of digital entertainment, however, with considerations made to the limitations of a computer in simulating such things, many different approaches have been made to simulate insanity, but most fall into two categories. One of the earliest permutations of the sanity meter was in the first Friday the 13th game ever released. This game on the Commodore 64, Amstrad, and Spectrum simulates fear by slowly raising a fear meter represented by a surprised-looking camper in the game's HUD, which, if maxed out, caused the character to die of fright. It was primitive, certainly, but it had a lot of good ideas. Jumping forward in time, the sanity meter made one of its more influential leaps in its implementation in Clock Tower 3, a sequel to the same Clock Tower series that I mentioned in my previous video about terror in horror games. Clock Tower's sanity meter, though it was in this case a panic meter, was realized as a depleting gauge, not unlike the health bar that you could usually see in other games, which represents the character's current mental state. As they're put in more and more stressful situations, the gauge would drop, and upon complete loss, the character would fall into a state of panic and begin to act on their own without heeding input from the player, usually leading them to their death. This marked the first major divergence in sanity mechanics, which I'll get into momentarily, which dealt with the insanity that affects the character, or what I'll define as player agency mechanics. The game that truly popularized the sanity meter, and became something of a poster child for what I'll call player perception mechanics, was a survival horror game called Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, which may already give you a clue as to how much of a center stage their sanity mechanic took. In Eternal Darkness, the player is shown a gauge, much like a health bar, which represents the character's current grip on reality. When the player is forced to engage with an enemy or witnesses certain events, the sanity meter begins to deplete, and could only be replenished by, essentially, making the character feel as though they were in control of their situation, through fighting monsters and doing finishing moves, where the player kills a monster definitively, or by casting spells. When the player was confronted with insanity in Eternal Darkness, the game, instead of causing the player's character to receive a negative effect, instead took a page from Hideo Kojima's book and played the same trick that Psycho Mantis performs in the first Metal Gear Solid. The game would begin to mess with the player's head by emulating effects that might fool the player into thinking that something was wrong with the game itself. Blue screens of death, sudden changes in game volume with an emulation of a common TV overlay, pretending to delete the player's save data, and many others. The concept of the player themselves being affected by diminishing sanity was extremely novel, and the extreme to which it took its sanity mechanics has landed Eternal Darkness on a good number of top 10 games that mess with their players lists. So novel, perhaps, that Nintendo even felt the need to patent the mechanic. Good one, Nintendo. You go ahead and stop other people from doing fun things. Ever the ally of innovation. What TV Tropes affectionately calls interface screw aside, this form of player perception mechanic has become something of a mainstay in horror games, though the line between player and character blurs in first-person horror, which has become the de facto default. Both of these types of mechanics are employed to varying degrees, often together, to simulate a decrease in sanity. Player agency mechanics are arguably a significantly more invasive type of gameplay experience, as they fundamentally alter the way that the player interacts with the game. The act of removing a player's ability to function within the rule set that's defined at the start of a game means that the player's buy-in is extremely important. It's very easy for what is expected to be a simple flavor mechanic to quickly devolve, in the eyes of a player, into feeling like the game is cheating, especially when sanity effects can lead to the death of a player character. This puts a very strong onus upon the designer to ensure that this balance is struck, and that when the player's agency is removed, they're aware of why and they're ready to accept it. Player perception mechanics are less risky by that right than agency mechanics, as they mostly only meddle with the player's ability to correctly interpret what's happening in-game. Through subtle mechanics like the filmographic Dutch angle slowly becoming more and more apparent, to outright hallucinations like those in the Fear series, they can provide a sense of dread in the player, but one must be careful to ensure that the player never becomes fully aware of their real ineffectiveness, if they are ineffective, as once the player is aware that the visual effects have no real significance aside from to startle them, players can quickly learn to ignore them. While some games, like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, have innovated on the usage of the sanity mechanic by causing it to directly affect the aggressiveness of nearby monsters as well as the player's ability to control their character, or innovations like the very subtle Gene Forge mechanic where NPCs begin to react to the player negatively as they become more prone to fits of rage, it's usually just another way to kill a less careful player, as was the unfortunate case with Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth, where the fear effects were mostly just bluster without mechanical effect until a hard threshold where the player just kills themselves. When employed carefully, a sanity mechanic can add a very visceral layer to a horror game. Hallucinations and subtle hindrances to the efficacy of a character's abilities have the ability to both creep out and panic the player and create a very memorable experience. The fear that not only the things that go bump in the night might get you, but also that your mind itself may end up working against you has the potential to play a very strong role in supplementing terror, as a player can very easily be fooled into second-guessing themselves, taking away a degree of power that would help to elevate the terror in a player. And that's one of the greatest components of terror, the fear that you may not fully be able to trust even yourself and your own senses. It's a difficult thing to achieve, but those games that do, more often than not, become modern horror game classics. For now though, that's all we have. Thank you as always for watching the show, and happy Horror Month. I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode, and that you'll continue to come by and enjoy all of the content that we have to offer, educational, editorial, and entertaining alike. Do hit that subscriber button if you'd like to keep tabs. We're in the thick of Horror Month, where we present horror games great and small right now, but however you choose to find us, I hope that you come again soon. See you tomorrow, and take care.